Thank you for coming out and your interest. And just to amplify on a couple of things that Tim said, if I were to try to, since I have no sense of direction, if I were to try to take you on a tour, the result would be everybody sitting here would be lost, including me. So we're not going to try that. As he said, the layout of this building, which is very, very different than anything that I can remember, and I'll evoke hopefully some of those memories with Kathy's help, is that there was an office space which was occupied by the office staff, and everything else was machinery, and it was noisy and hot. So I'm going to be looking at notes because I'm old enough that I don't have all that confidence in my memory, but I will tell you that when I got the initial invitation, which was roughly over a year ago, to do this, the event, as you all may know, was postponed for COVID reasons. I was extremely gratified and excited, and still am, to be here. I did my best to get ready, which meant I tried to find what I knew, and I discovered it wasn't much. Because my family, my father and my grandfather, and you'll hear mostly about them as a result of this, didn't talk much about the business and the internal workings of it. But I did get, as a result of my daughter interviewing my grandfather, who you'll hear a lot about, because it was his vision and his skills and people skills and organizational ability that created the Strasburg Silk Mill, which later became the Strasburg Textile Mill. And my daughter, he lived to be 105. He lived till 101 independently. I will tell you, and I suspect everybody sitting here has somebody in their family who they can look at and say, somebody who is used to doing and had the kind of life that he had, and that probably some of your family, if not all of some member of your family had, when they can't do what they do and they can't live independently, they don't handle it well. But he lived independently till he was 101, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We have a small enough that if there are any questions, either now or when I'm done or any other time, please just let me know that by raising your hand or standing up or something, and I'll stop. I think that's the way that most people can identify with what we're talking about. In any case, we gathered it all together, and again, I concluded that I didn't know much, and I was getting desperate to the point where I was going to have to just put together a talk about based on what I did know, and then Kathy saved me. And she sent me or Tim did, or some combination, sent me her 2 articles, and that convinced me of a couple of things. One was that as a result, the people that had something to do with that mill, that worked there, that labored there, the families that were involved, all knew more than me, collectively, and in some cases individually. But it did bring back memories, because the names that were mentioned, some of them I actually not only remembered once I saw them, but visualized. I always kid my significant other that these advertisements that some of you may have seen about this over-the-counter thing called Prevagen. I said, I don't know whether to attribute it to that or not, which is probably because it's not you. But in any case, I remembered their names, particularly the office staff, and I remembered the layout, because when you walked into the office, there was a lady whose first name is Dorothy. I cannot remember her last name. You may know Kathy, who sat right by the door. Then there was Margaret Stickley. Then there was Ada Morris. And then there was my father and my grandfather, who had 2 desks in the room next to Ada. And these persons were part of the family, as were so many of the employees of the mill. And we really considered it a family business. And when I read these articles, as I said, besides my very quick impression that Kathy knew more as a result of talking to these people than I did, and my brother, as I told him, was no help at all. He knew what I knew, but he didn't know any more. So I said, well, he's not here. He's going to try to get up in the fall. Let's talk about it a minute, because what I can do, and we'll try to do, and I appreciate you all being here and being interested, is talk about how the mill became the mill, and the reason, in my opinion, is the vision and the history of my grandfather and then my father, Charles Platt, and their spouses. My grandmother Rose, who was married to him for 67 years, we're convinced that she was sainted somewhere along the line for staying with him that long. And my mom, Adele, who was married to my dad for 40 years before he passed at an age younger than I am from cancer, back in 1986. My daughter, my 2 children are 44 and 40. If you think that makes you feel old, imagine how I feel. My daughter interviewed my grandfather at the age of 102 and 104. He kept his faculties, as I said, to the very end. He outlived his wife, Rose, by 20 years. And he outlived his only child, my dad, Nathan, by about a decade. And anybody that knew him observed that, well, let's put it this way, I never saw that man, who I considered to be the strongest individual I had ever encountered, shed a tear about anything until his wife died. And then again when my dad died. And after that, if you mentioned either of them in any way, even a recollection, you could see a tear well up in his eye, and that told me something. When he finally could not live independently, and there's a story behind that, and then I'll get back to the mill, but I can't resist. When he was 93, our family doctor, who was Dr. Gurmroth, and who referred him to an orthopedic surgeon because he was having trouble walking. And the orthopedic surgeon at the age of 93 told him, Charlie, your knees are going to give out eventually, you need to have knee replacement surgery. To which Dr. Gurmroth and I both said, he's out of his mind. We don't operate on anybody at that age unless it's life-threatening. So he didn't do it. When his knees did give out at 101, he blamed me. And Dr. Gurmroth. Dr. Gurmroth best summed it up by saying, Charlie, if I'd had any idea you were honorary enough to live this long, I'd have told you go ahead. And that was the answer to that. But as I said, what that taught me was that somebody who's led the kind of life which I'm going to describe in a minute, which is in the context of the mill, does not handle limitations well. And he didn't. At 101, he entered the Shenandoah Memorial Hospital extended care facility at the time. He had been on the board. He had helped plan and finance the building. But now he was a resident. They were not fun for him, and frankly, they were not fun for me, but his life was an inspiration and still is to my brother and me. That said, let's get back to the mill. He was born in a place called Tomaszów, Poland, which at the time was in Russia, in 1893. And he was the eldest of 6 children, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In 1914, he, at the age of 19, he came to America via stowage, or as I said when he was attending my investiture as a judge, a la Leonardo DiCaprio. He tells the story, told my daughter that his plan was to come over on stowage to the United States and as he said, quote, and I quote, "It was bad living under a dictator. The Russian Revolution occurred in 1917, and I left Poland 3 days before the First World War. Quote, I didn't want to give 7 years of my life to the Russian army." And he told my daughter that when he explained what he was going to do to his father and his father said, "Well, you're taking Rose with you." And he said, "No, I'll send for her." And he said, "No, you're taking her with you or you're not going. And I'll see to it." And so they did. For 12 days, they left from Rotterdam and they landed at Ellis Island. When he was at Ellis Island, again, my daughter, she asked him, "Well, what did you think of America when you landed?" And his answer was, quote, I didn't have a chance to think. I had to get settled. All I knew was I liked it better than Russia." And so that's what he did. While he was being processed, they couldn't pronounce his name. His name, when he came over here, was Plachta. They couldn't pronounce it, so they kept putting he and my grandmother at the bottom of the pile. His solution to that was to change his name. And he told him apparently told him it was a typo or something, and he changed it to what they could pronounce, which was Platt, and it stayed. So that was his way of getting it processed. And as I thought back, I said, you know, that evidenced a pattern. And the pattern that it evidenced, that was evident for the rest of his life, was he did what he had to do to get what he needed done. And in this case, what he needed done was getting processed and getting out of there. And that's what happened. He then ended up, he and my grandmother, they settled on the Lower East Side of New York, which is where most European immigrants, they had a 6th grade education in effect, both of them. They were both, my grandmother and he were what he referred to as trained weavers. They were hand weavers. They weaved cloth. That's what they knew how to do. And so they bought, somehow they scraped the money together to buy a loom, and then they bought another loom. And they were building their own independent business or small business, small with a definite small, while they were struggling on the East Side. And then eventually they kept buying more. Eventually they moved to Paterson, New Jersey, and they stayed there for 17 years. My dad was born in 1915, and he moved with them to Paterson, New Jersey. And they continued doing that. During the period of time, although they had what amounted to a 6th grade education, they did have vocational training, is what we'll call it. They were the weavers, and that's what they did. But he spoke 4 languages, which I didn't know until he told my daughter. He spoke Russian, German, Polish, and Yiddish. And soon he spoke 5 languages because he and my grandmother taught themselves English while they were living on the Lower East Side and again in Paterson. And they did that while they got odd jobs, and then they got looms, and so about 1 year later in Paterson, he was a member of the Textile Workers Union of America, despite the fact that he didn't want them organizing the Strasburg mill when they tried. But what he did do is, there was a strike. His solution to that was he had to work. He ended up going back into New York, in effect commuting, because he figured out that ladies' hats, he knew that he was not very religious, but he knew that Jewish women had to wear hats when they were out, and that there was always going to be a market and a need for that, so that's what he did. And then the strike was over, and then he went back to Patterson, and he and my grandmother continued what I refer to as their small business. In 1929, he went back to see his family to Europe. But for some reason that it's unclear to us why, my grandmother didn't go with him. I guess maybe because she was raised by my father. She went back in 1932. That was the last time that either of them saw their family, because their families were mostly lost in the Holocaust. At that point, my dad was in the Army. He was a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and he was stationed in Germany. And of course, that service was quite poignant to my grandfather for the reason I just mentioned. In 1933, my grandfather, and this was thanks to Kathy, because I didn't even know who he bought it from, because he didn't say anything. And he, at 1933 or 32, it's unclear exactly what period, but it was within that year or so, he bought what was the building that was here. And I believe their name was pronounced Birchinger, was that correct? He bought whatever the building was from them, he being my grandfather. My father was born in 1915, so we were talking, he was around 18 years old at the time. During that period, I asked him, and this is I said, how did the Depression affect you? And he went, not at all. I was lucky. So he was, and that was his word. I did what I did, and it worked. But I often wonder why didn't he talk about it, and knowing him, he probably didn't think it was important. Okay, my son was Jason was born on his birthday, and he's incommunicative in the same way about his business. And I said, I've seen this movie before, and in any case, the financing came from a mysterious figure, although he was mysterious because we didn't meet him, we heard him on the phone. And to be quite honest, as I've said, he had a financial benefactor. Don't have any idea how he found him or how the benefactor found him, but he had help buying the mill from an individual named Joseph Gluck, who was in New York. And based on what I did observe from Mr. Gluck and my grandfather and their relationship together, I would say that if you called Hollywood and you said, listen, we're making a movie about New York, we need somebody to play a really obnoxious New Yorker, they would have sent him. The way he did with it, the relationship that they had was essentially he was financing him, and he had a piece of the business for a period of time until he was paid off. But he operated from New York. And he yelled a lot. I can remember watching my grandfather take the phone, this is the phone, sit it over on the table about a foot away, and let him rant, and didn't listen to a word he said. And periodically he would walk over and say into the phone, "Are you done?" And apparently there was no consequence to that, because they stayed in business until he went. His two sons, who I did meet and did know, were exact opposite of their father. They spent summers here in Strasburg, loved it, okay, for at least 4 or 5 summers. One spent longer than that. And their names were Sandy and Morning, and they have still fond memories. They're pretty old now, but they have fond memories to this day of this town. I don't know that they have fond memories of their father, but they do have fond memories of our family and so forth. And when Kathy was writing, and I was reading her articles more than once to help me, and the comment from almost everybody that she talked to and that she reported on was that the mill, if you worked there, you knew 2 things. You might know more than 2 things, but 2 things you knew for sure is it was hot and it was noisy. Nathan Platt's sons and Charlie Platt's grandsons couldn't have agreed more. It's why we're not here and the bill isn't here, okay? To be quite honest. And so that was, the source of that is not only the people, but it occurred to me that, you know, I'm here and I'm glad to be here and I'm glad to be able to do this, and the fact that you're sitting here interested in it is extremely gratifying in a way that I can't completely describe. That said, as Kathy noted in her articles, we're talking about town stories and gossip. My sources are probably not as good as hers. For instance, my dad described the vote on the unionization as much greater than 2 votes, but the employees, I think, probably remember better than he did. And but in any case, that when I saw that that was the source, I couldn't help remember my grandfather loved this town, loved this community. My father, the same. They stayed here after the mill closed. And both of them lived here until the end of their lives, as did their wives and the families. My brother and I, and it was a very good business. I remember my dad saying, before you can do whatever you want, but you know, this is a very profitable business. It's a very nice community. You sure you want to walk? And we didn't like the noise. We didn't like the heat. I worked here a couple of summers. Basically what he had me doing was writing up tickets for for what they were shipping. And my behavior was not a model. And I remember more than once having a discussion about how I need to be a role model. And you're definitely not a role model. And my brother had the same lectures several times, but we wanted to do different things, and they respected that. As a matter of fact, my grandfather never tried to get my father to do what he did. He was very happy that he did, but he initially encouraged him to do whatever he wanted to do. As a footnote, my grandfather, I went to the University of Virginia, undergraduate. My brother went to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, undergraduate, and my father went to North Carolina State. So the ACC in those days was World War III. But in any case, my grandfather had a penchant for making up stuff to see if who would listen to him. And one of the things that he did, and he used to take us, and I don't know whether there's anybody here old enough to remember, but where I remembered where I got my hair cut, and I wish I had some to get cut now, was a barbershop run by a gentleman named Carol Bush. And my grandfather was the one that took us to the barbershop whenever we were ready, whenever he saw the need to do so. And he would run into his friends. There were 2 places that he hung out. One was the Carol Bush Barber Shop, whenever he could. And the other one, which was the building over there, I'm not sure what it is now, but when we were growing up, the building across the street was Tracy Lindbergh's Amoco station. And my friend Ray, who I haven't seen for 50 years, since he was at my wedding, was you know, very close personal friend, and my grandfather hung out over there. Kind of funny because when they so he would make up stories that just to see what would happen, and he would one of his favorite stories was that he would tell whoever he thought might listen or pay attention to him that the Platts drove the Indians out of the Shenandoah Valley, and that the building was where the Indians' land. And my father had to tell both my brother and I that was total nonsense and don't pay any attention to him. And the other one that my favorite was that when he was immigrated, he was naturalized under President Theodore Roosevelt. So when someone would say to him, because he was very active in the Republican Party, and he registered as a Republican because Theodore Roosevelt at the time was a Republican, and he thought he owed him. And so when he was asked, why are you a Republican, he would say, because my father was a Republican and my grandfather was a Republican. And that was when so I remember asking my dad, were there Republicans and Democrats in Russia? And he explained to me, again, this is your grandfather making stuff up. And he's getting entertained by it, so let him be entertained, even if he's the only one being entertained. One of the stories that Kathy made me remember, and that I did remember, and a little bit of a dimension greater than it was what she described as the Great Silk Mill Robbery. And the Great Silk Mill Robbery, it's unclear to me when it was, but it had to be when my father had taken over the management. Because I remember my father every night, because the mill was operating 365 days, 24/7, 365 days a year. And the shift changed at 2, I believe 2 and 10 and 8. My father would walk up from our house on Brown Street at around 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. every night to, in effect, supervise or observe the shift change, and on payday to pay, which was in cash, in envelopes. And he would pay the shift when they would change as they were walking out the door. He, for some reason that we just don't recall, my father wasn't in town, or for some reason was not available to do that duty that night. So my grandfather substituted, in effect, and did what he probably had been doing for years before my father started doing it. When he did, he was assaulted with some kind of bar. It was like and he was hit over the head. The money was stolen, and he was hospitalized. And to the day he died, he had we think it was steel, but it was some sort of metal plate in his top of his head. He lived, and he had given the individual who did that, who was caught. I didn't know how they caught him, but Kathy had mentioned in her article, apparently he was not the smartest criminal in the world. Being a judge, I often say if the criminals most of them were smart, I'd be out of business, so I'm glad they're not. He was arrested, charged, and apparently ultimately convicted. My grandfather gets out of the hospital, and apparently what had happened was this individual had a criminal record to begin with, had been arrested for previous crimes and convicted, gets out of jail, is a convict, and my grandfather decides to give him a job when no one else would. My father didn't want to, but he basically overruled him in those days. And of course he gives him a job, and this happens. When he gets out of the hospital, my father's the one that told me this story. He gets up one morning and he decides he's going to go visit this guy in the jail and confront him. I don't know who he was or what his name was. He goes to the jail, and as he said, my father said, and he quotes, he goes up, asks to see him, doesn't say who he is or why he's there, and they say he's a visitor. So he goes in, looks at him, and says, and I quote, except he didn't use the initials, USOB, I gave you a job when you got out of jail, and this is what I get in return? Answer, I didn't know it was you, Mr. Charlie. I thought it was Mr. Nathan. Yeah. Charles, in response, quote, you dumbass, that's even worse. And again, I don't doubt for a moment, knowing him, that he did that. That was his style. The mill stopped making silk, I think. Again, my source is my dad, and it was a long time ago. My dad died in 1986, around the beginning of World War II, and shifted to synthetics, nylon, rayon, and acetate cloth. It made parachute rope cords and other stuff for the war during that period of time. And then after that, started making cloth for curtains. And some, although it was undefined what, women's clothing. I don't know what you could use for curtains and women's clothing, but whatever it was, according to my father, that's what they did. Then looking back and reflecting, they operated basically from 1933 to 1977. And they did what had to be done, and when you hear what my grandfather told my daughter when she asked him how he did what he did, you'll understand what his philosophy was, and you probably understand it intuitively anyway, to survive in a capitalist economy. My father, who was my grandfather's only child, and my mother moved to Strasburg after they got married and after the war. Well, they got married, and then he went in the army in the European theater, and then came back. They moved to Strasburg, and in effect combined with my grandfather and my grandmother to develop what they referred to as, they did refer to it this way, as the family business. I was born on January 1st of 1947 in Woodstock, not at the, it's not a hospital, I think it was like a care facility, nursing home, and my brother was born in '51. As I said, we both worked in the mill for early teens, long enough to conclude that, like every other employee, we didn't like the noise or the heat, and wanted to do other things. And that meant we weren't going to be involved in the business. That decision coincided by us with, and there was a side of the business that wasn't visible here in Strasburg, which was whatever they made had to be sold. And where it was sold was 7th Avenue in New York City, which is a culture in and of itself. To say that it's different and more noisy, although not necessarily more hot, than Strasburg is an understatement. My father said, before you walk away, okay, and walk if you want, okay, I hear you about staying here, you don't want to run the factory. Are you interested in doing the selling and being involved in that in New York? And if you are, we'll let you, you'll spend a week or two with my selling partner, okay? Well, I did, and I very quickly decided I didn't want to do that. That was even less attractive. And both because of the culture and because of I love New York, but I had it unrealistically good. But I didn't want to do that. So I ended up working for the company's New York lawyers. My brother didn't even get that far. He didn't want to look, okay? He wanted to be a sportscaster, which is what he ended up being in Salisbury, North Carolina. Again, he's hoping to be here in the fall and to come back. So we both walked away. By coincidence, my father and my grandfather, and this is now around the latter part, they brought some people in. They were competitive as a mill, not with what we refer to as the big guys, North Carolina, Burlington Mills, those big factories. They were also not the little guy. They were somehow in the middle. So they were filling orders that the big guys weren't interested in, but the little guys weren't capable of filling in. What they got told was that their machinery was very quickly becoming obsolete and was totally depreciated and would have no value, and they would not be able to be competitive within probably a year or two. And so the decision was either invest, and this is around the 1970s, the late 70s, either get ready to invest $1 million, which was a lot more in the 1970s than it is now, or retire. And that was the call. they then thought, okay, the next generation has already made their decision. My grandfather didn't want to retire. My father liked to play golf. And those discussions, as I observed them, were, you know, he finally looked at me and said, well, you don't really want to run the mill again, do you? And the answer, truthfully, was, no, but I like hanging out. And I want to be able to, I want to have some place to go. And my dad was unwilling to keep doing what he was doing in the face of the expert advice that they were getting. The machinery, which was encompassed this entire building, whatever was here when they left, was sold to a group in Haiti and moved. The transportation costs, you can imagine this is heavy machinery, was more than what the machinery was worth on paper. And so but it was done. And the building was sold to Wayside of Virginia, or one of its entities. There was I can't remember the gentleman's name, but it was a Riggs Bank chair was the head of that at that time. I don't know whether he still is or not. And it became where you're sitting today, the Emporium, and that is here today. It's very different looking than obviously than anything that I can remember. Both of them stayed here. My dad died in 1986 from cancer, younger than I am today. My grandfather, as I said, lived to be 105. My grandfather was on the town council during the period of time that the mill was operating, as well as a little bit after it, not much. Then my father went on the town council. They cared about this community. And not just in the council. My grandfather was extremely proud that he was first a Mason, then a Shriner, and that he was involved in charitable activities both in this community and in the county generally, and in the state, and frankly in the country. And my father was more of a golfer and enjoyed it the limited amount of time he had before his health failed playing golf. I do remember one conversation I can't resist telling you. My father goes on the town council, and he comes back and he's talking to my grandfather about town business, and he says, yeah, I want you to know that it wasn't easy, but we've decided at that time, I think it was that we're going to shift the parking meters on Main Street from penny to nickel. And my grandfather looked at him and went, well, so it's clear that didn't happen on my watch. And let me see how I'm doing on time. Not bad, right? Kathy summed up. I was sitting there, how am I going to close? And to be quite honest, you closed for me, okay? And I couldn't say any better than you did. And what you said bears repeating. And what you said was that the history of the silk mill remains a part of the heritage of many families in this town, in the town of Strasburg. Many residents made their living by working on one of these shifts at the textile mill during a time when there were few places to work to support a family. Employees worked alongside their relatives and neighbors during the day and evening and through the night until the morning. Many of those employees came to work and stayed for years, as their children and grandchildren remember. In today's world, it is typical for workers to change jobs, and believe me, I'm aware of that. I've seen my own children do this, and even sometimes careers many times before retirement. But back then, there weren't as many jobs to choose from, and people felt comfortable to stay with the companies they trusted. The silk mill changed and adapted as the world changed, and so did the employees. That said, I can't help but look back when my daughter, Sarah, who, by the way, was named after my grandfather's mother, Sarah, interviewed him. And she ended her interview with my 102-year-old, or I think it was 102 or 104, and it dovetails perfectly with what you said, okay? She looked at my grandfather, and they interviewed him at the facility, and she said, what is the secret of your success and longevity? And his answer was, no secret. Life changes. When it does, you have to change with it. No choice. If you don't, you will fail at whatever you're trying to do. But always remember and help the people that helped you. Lessons lived and learned. I'm speaking on behalf of my brother, my children, my new twin grandchildren. My son, by the way, has twins that are 2 years old. One of them's named Charlie. We keep referring to him as my grandfather as the original Charlie, as opposed to the later Charlie. He's got this crazy theory that somehow or other these 2-year-olds are going to emerge and behave perfectly when they get to be 4. I went, not based on anything I've experienced, including with you. Very, very proud that there were people in this community, some of whom, a progeny, are still here, that trusted our company, trusted my grandfather, trusted my family, and it's very, very gratifying for me to be able to be here with you and remember those times. And again, thank you for coming and listening.